Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UFS Horizon and watched the stars drift past the main viewing screen. The year was 2387, and humanity had been part of the Galactic Federation for almost 200 years. But they were still treated like children by the other species. The Zephyrians, with their tall blue bodies and crystal weapons, looked down on humans as weak creatures who lived short lives and broke easily. The Nexari, with their silver skin and computer minds, thought humans were too emotional and stupid to be trusted with important missions. Even the peaceful Alderans, who looked like giant flowers, considered humans to be a lesser race that needed protection. Jake did not like being treated this way, but he had learned to live with it. He was 43 years old, which made him middle-aged, by human standards, but ancient by galactic ones. Most species lived for thousands of years, and they thought humans who died after only a century were barely worth knowing. The Federation gave human ships the boring jobs like mapping empty space and checking on old mining stations that nobody else wanted to visit. Dr. Lisa Carter walked onto the bridge carrying her tablet computer. She was the ship's chief scientist, and one of the smartest people Jake had ever met. Lisa had brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail and wore the standard blue uniform of the Federation Science Corps. She looked tired because she had been working for 16 hours straight on her latest research project about quantum energy fields. Pete Rodriguez was already at his station checking the ship's engines. Pete was the chief engineer, and he could fix anything that broke on the ship. He had dark skin and strong hands that were always covered in grease from working on machinery. Pete came from Earth's Mexico region, and he spoke with an accent that reminded Jake of home. Most humans in the galaxy had given up their old cultures, but Pete was proud of where he came from. The three humans had been working together for 5 years, and they trusted each other completely. This was unusual in the Federation, where most crews were mixed species and nobody really understood anyone else. Human crews were rare because the Federation leaders thought humans worked better when they were scattered among other species who could keep them under control. Jake was reading the daily reports when the ship's communication system made a loud beeping sound. Lisa looked up from her tablet and Pete turned away from his control panel. The signal was coming from outside Federation space, which was strange because nothing was supposed to be out there. The outer rim territories had been explored decades ago and found to be empty of intelligent life. The signal was weak and full of static, but Jake could hear a voice speaking in the common galactic language. The words were broken and hard to understand, but the speaker sounded frightened and desperate. Jake told the computer to clean up the signal and make it clearer. After a few minutes, they could hear the message better. The voice belonged to a Kithara scientist named Dr. Zan, who was calling for help from something he called the Devourers. He said they had come from the dark space between galaxies and were consuming entire worlds. The message was 3 days old, which meant Dr. Zan was probably already dead, but Jake felt they had to investigate anyway. Pete shook his head and said it was probably just equipment failure or space pirates trying to trick them. Lisa thought they should report the signal to Federation Command and let someone else deal with it. But Jake had a strange feeling in his stomach that told him this was something important and dangerous. Jake sent the signal to Federation headquarters on the planet Centauri Prime, where the Council of Species met to make decisions for the galaxy. He expected them to send a battleship to investigate, because that was what they usually did when there might be trouble. Instead, he got a message back from Admiral Vex, who was a Zephyrian with no patience for human concerns. Admiral Vex said the signal was probably fake and that humans were always seeing threats where none existed. He ordered Jake to continue with his current mission, which was mapping empty space in the Tau sector. The Admiral said humans were too emotional and scared easily, which made them unreliable when it came to real security matters. Jake stared at the message on his screen and felt anger rising in his chest. The Federation always dismissed human concerns as paranoia or stupidity. They treated humans like pets who needed to be protected from their own fear and imagination. But Jake had been in space for 20 years, and he had learned to trust his instincts about danger. He looked at Lisa and Pete, who were waiting for his decision. They could follow orders and continue mapping empty space while ignoring the distress call. Or they could disobey direct orders and investigate the signal, which would probably end their careers in the Federation fleet. Jake made his choice and told Pete to set course for the Kythera system where the signal had come from. Lisa protested that they would be in serious trouble for disobeying orders, but Jake said some things were more important than following rules. He had a feeling that whatever was happening in Kythera space was going to change everything for humans and the rest of the galaxy. The UFS Horizon dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kythera system, and Jake Morrison felt his blood turn cold. Where there should have been 15 planets full of life and cities, there was nothing but dead rocks floating in space. The planets were still there, but they looked like they had been sucked dry of everything that made them alive. The oceans were gone, and the atmosphere had been stripped away, leaving only bare stone and metal. Lisa Carter ran her scanners over the dead worlds, and her hands shook as she read the results. She told Jake that according to her instruments, the planets had been alive just 1 week ago. There had been cities and forests and oceans full of fish, but now there was nothing. Whatever had killed the Kythera system had worked incredibly fast. Pete Rodriguez was monitoring the ship's defensive systems when he picked up another human vessel on the edge of the system. It was the research ship UFS Discovery, commanded by Alex Stone, who Jake had known at the Academy 15 years ago. Alex was a good officer who specialized in studying alien technology, and his ship was supposed to be exploring empty space 3 sectors away. Jake opened a communication channel, and Alex's face appeared on the screen. Alex looked like he had not slept for days, and his eyes were red from crying. Behind him, Jake could see other crew members who looked just as scared and tired. Alex said his team had been studying ancient ruins on the 4th planet when the Devourers arrived. Alex told them about creatures that seemed to exist partially outside normal space and time. He said they were enormous beings made of dark energy that could pass through solid matter like it was not there. The Devourers had arrived in ships that looked like giant black crystals and immediately began draining the life from every living thing they could find. The Kythera people had tried to fight back with their plasma weapons and energy shields, but nothing had worked. The Devourers seemed to absorb the energy from the weapons and grow stronger. They could predict every move the Kythera military made and counter it perfectly. Within hours, the entire civilization was dead, and the creatures were feeding on the life energy of the planets themselves. Alex said his research team had only survived because they were underground in an ancient bunker when the attack began. They had stayed hidden for 3 days while the Devourers finished consuming everything above ground. When they finally came out, the planets were dead and the creatures were gone, but Alex had managed to record everything with his scientific equipment. Lisa asked to see the recordings, and Alex transmitted them to the Horizon. What they saw made everyone on the bridge feel sick with fear. The Devourers looked like huge shadows with tentacles made of dark energy. They moved through space without ships and seemed to communicate by changing the color of the energy around their bodies. When they touched living things, the creatures would glow brighter while the life forms withered and died. But the most terrifying thing was how smart they were. The recordings showed them learning and adapting to every defense the Kythera tried. When the Kythera used energy weapons, the Devourers absorbed the energy. When they tried kinetic weapons, the creatures phased out of normal space and let the projectiles pass through them. It was like fighting an enemy that could predict every move before it was made. Jake was studying the recordings when the ship's alarms suddenly began screaming. Pete shouted that something was approaching them from the dark space between the dead planets. On the main screen, they could see 3 small objects that looked like black crystals flying toward them at incredible speed. Alex's voice came over the radio telling them to run because those were Devourer probe ships. But it was too late because the probes had already surrounded both human vessels. Jake ordered Pete to raise shields and prepare weapons, but he knew it would probably not help if these creatures were as powerful as Alex said. The probes began scanning both ships with beams. of dark energy, and Jake could feel something trying to push into his mind. It was like having someone poke around inside his thoughts, looking for something. Lisa gasped and grabbed her head, saying she could feel the creatures trying to read her memories. Pete was struggling to keep the ship's systems working as the scanning beams interfered with their electronics. But then something strange happened. The probes suddenly stopped scanning and moved back as if they were confused. The dark energy beams flickered and changed color like the creatures were having trouble maintaining them. Jake could still feel something in his mind, but it felt uncertain and frustrated instead of threatening. Alex's voice came over the radio again, but this time he sounded amazed instead of scared. He said the probes were behaving differently than they had with the Kythera. When they had scanned the Kythera ships, the process had been quick and efficient, but now they seemed to be having problems reading human thoughts and technology. Lisa was monitoring the probe's scanning frequencies, and she made an incredible discovery. She told Jake that human brain patterns were completely different from other species in the galaxy. Most aliens thought in logical, predictable ways, but human minds were chaotic and emotional. The Devourers seemed to be designed to read and predict logical thought patterns, but human consciousness was too random and unpredictable for them to understand properly. The probes continued to circle the human ships for another hour, but they could not seem to get a clear reading on anything. Finally, they gave up and flew away back into the dark space between the planets. Jake and his crew sat in stunned silence as they realized they had just survived an encounter that had destroyed an entire civilization. Alex suggested they return to Federation space immediately and report what they had learned. But Jake knew the Federation Council would not believe them because humans were always dismissed as paranoid and unreliable. He made the decision to gather more evidence first, so they would have proof of the threat. As the two human ships prepared to leave the dead system, Jake looked back at the lifeless planets and felt a chill run down his spine. Whatever these Devourers were, they represented a threat unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, and humanity might be the only species capable of fighting them. Jake Morrison had been wrong about the Federation Council not believing them. When he and Alex Stone presented their evidence about the Devourers, the council members took the threat very seriously. Admiral Vex himself apologized for dismissing the human concerns and immediately ordered the mobilization of the entire Federation fleet. Within days, massive battleships from every species were moving toward the Outer Rim territories to face this new enemy. The Zephyrian Empire sent their most powerful warships equipped with quantum cannons that could destroy entire moons. The Nexari Collective deployed their advanced AI-controlled fleets that could calculate battle strategies faster than any living mind. The Alderaan Defense Corps contributed their bioships that could heal themselves and adapt to any attack. It was the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history. Jake felt confident that such overwhelming firepower would be enough to stop the Devourers, but he was horribly wrong. The first battle reports came in just 3 days after the fleets reached the Outer Rim, and they were beyond anything anyone had imagined. The Zephyrian quantum weapons had no effect on creatures that existed partially outside normal space-time. The Nexari AI systems were somehow corrupted and turned against their own ships. The Alderaan bioships were drained of life just like the planets in the Kythera system. Fleet after fleet was destroyed as the Devourers spread through Federation space like a plague. The creatures seemed to learn from each battle and become stronger and smarter. When the Rigelian Navy tried to use dimensional mines, the Devourers absorbed the explosions and grew larger. When the Centaurian Guard attempted to use psionic attacks, the creatures turned the mental energy back on the attackers and drove them insane. Lisa Carter was working around the clock in her laboratory trying to understand how the Devourers operated. She had been studying the sensor data from their encounter at Kythera, and she was beginning to see patterns that nobody else had noticed. The creatures seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once, which made them nearly impossible to hurt with conventional weapons. But more importantly, they appeared to have a collective intelligence that could predict and counter any logical military strategy. Meanwhile, Pete Rodriguez was modifying the Horizon's weapons and defense systems based on what they had learned. He knew standard Federation technology would be useless against the Devourers, but he had some ideas about using the ship's power systems in ways they were never designed for. Pete had always been good at making things work differently than their original purpose, and now that skill might save their lives. The refugee crisis began when the outer colonies started evacuating toward the core worlds. Millions of beings from dozens of species fled their homes as planet after planet fell to the Devourers. The Federation's transportation network was overwhelmed as every available ship was pressed into service to move civilians away from the advancing threat. Lieutenant Sam Parker was commanding the transport ship USS Liberty when she received orders to evacuate the Altarian colonies near the Vega system. Sam was only 28 years old, and this was her first major command, but she had no choice except to do her best. The Altarians were a peaceful species that looked like tall, thin humanoids with silver skin, and they had never been in a war before. Sam arrived at the colony world of New Altaria to find complete chaos. The planetary government had collapsed. When news of the Devourer attacks reached them and millions of civilians were trying to get on any ship that could take them away. Sam had space for only 10,000 passengers, but there were nearly 1 million Altarians who needed evacuation. She made the difficult decision to focus on children and elderly Altarians first, because they would be most vulnerable if the Devourers arrived. It took 3 trips to move everyone to safety, and each time Sam worried that the creatures would appear before she could return. The Altarians were grateful for human help, but they could not understand why the Federation's mighty military forces were losing so badly. On her final evacuation run, Sam encountered something that changed everything. A small group of Devourer scout ships appeared at the edge of the system while she was loading the last refugees. Sam knew her transport ship had no weapons that could hurt the creatures, but she could not abandon the civilians who were still on the planet. The scout ships began scanning Sam's vessel, just like the probes had done to Jake's ship at Kythera. But something unexpected happened when the dark energy beams touched Sam's mind. Instead of feeling helpless and afraid, she felt angry and determined to protect the innocent people under her care. That anger seemed to interfere with the scanning process, and the creatures backed away as if they had been hurt. Sam discovered that human emotions could actually disrupt the Devourer's abilities in ways that pure logic could not. When she focused her mind on protecting the refugees, the creatures seemed unable to predict her actions or read her thoughts clearly. She used this advantage to complete the evacuation and escape before the main Devourer force arrived to consume New Altaria. Back on the horizon, Jake was receiving reports from across the galaxy that painted a picture of complete disaster. The Zephyrian Empire had lost 60% of its fleet in just 1 week. The Nexari Collective was retreating toward their core systems as their AI networks continued to be corrupted by the Devourers. Even the ancient and powerful Vorthon Republic was abandoning entire sectors rather than face the advancing creatures. But scattered among the reports of defeat were strange stories about human crews and officers who seemed to have unusual success against the Devourers. Transport Captain Ellen Brooks had somehow fought off a probe attack while evacuating a mining station. Commander Ryan Clark's patrol ship had survived 3 encounters with scout vessels when larger warships had been destroyed immediately. Marine Sergeant Carol Davis had led a ground evacuation that saved thousands of lives when Devourer creatures attacked a research facility. Lisa made the connection that Jake had been hoping for. She told him that every successful human encounter with the Devourers had involved high emotional stress and unpredictable behavior. Human consciousness operated differently than any other known species, and that difference was somehow interfering with the creature's abilities. The very things that other species saw as human weaknesses were actually their greatest strengths against this particular enemy. Jake realized that humanity was going to play a much larger role in this war than anyone had expected. The galaxy's most powerful civilizations were crumbling before an enemy they could not understand or predict, but humans with their chaotic emotional minds were the one species that could fight back effectively. The weak had suddenly become the strong, and everything was about to change. The reports coming into Federation headquarters were unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Across hundreds of worlds, humans were displaying abilities that nobody, including themselves, had known they possessed. Dr. Lisa Carter was trying to catalog these new phenomena, but the data was so strange that she had trouble believing her own research. On the mining world of Kepler Station, a human foreman named Carl Johnson had somehow lifted a collapsed beam that weighed 3 tons to save trapped workers when devourer creatures attacked the facility. Carl was a normal middle-aged man who had never shown unusual strength before, but witnesses saw him move the massive steel beam with his bare hands while the creatures were draining energy from everything around them. At the Proxima Research Institute, a graduate student named Amy Walsh had experienced what she described as seeing into the future during a devourer attack. Amy claimed she could see exactly where the creatures would appear next, and she guided over 200 people to safety by predicting the safest evacuation routes. The Institute's security cameras confirmed that Amy seemed to know where dangers would occur several minutes before they actually happened. But perhaps the most significant case came from Captain Jake Morrison himself. During their latest encounter with Devourer scout ships, Jake found he could anticipate the creatures' movements in ways that should have been impossible. When a probe ship tried to phase through the Horizon's hull, Jake somehow knew exactly when and where it would reappear in normal space. This allowed Pete Rodriguez to target it with modified plasma cannons that actually damaged the creature. Lisa was working 20-hour days to understand what was happening to humans under extreme stress. Her analysis showed that human brain activity changed dramatically when facing the devourers. Normal human consciousness operated on chaotic quantum frequencies that were already unusual compared to other species, but under life-threatening stress, those frequencies became even more erratic and unpredictable. The breakthrough came when Lisa discovered that these chaotic brain patterns were interfering with the devourer's ability to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The creatures relied on quantum coherence to phase in and out of normal space, but human consciousness generated what Lisa called cognitive static that disrupted their dimensional abilities. When humans experienced strong emotions like fear, anger, or determination, their minds became quantum noise generators that the devourers could not filter out. Pete Rodriguez was having his own awakening in the engineering sections of the ship. He found that he could modify standard Federation technology in ways that should not have worked according to everything he knew about physics. When he focused his mind on making the ship's weapons affect creatures that existed partially outside reality, the modifications actually functioned exactly as he intended them to. Pete discovered he could sense the quantum fields that the devourers used to phase between dimensions. This ability allowed him to adjust the ship's sensors and weapons to track and target the creatures even when they were not fully present in normal space. Other human engineers throughout the galaxy were reporting similar experiences as they learned to trust their instincts over logical analysis. The Federation Council was forced to completely change their strategy as they realized that humans were the only species capable of fighting the devourers effectively. Admiral Vex, who had dismissed human concerns just weeks earlier, now found himself begging for human assistance. The proud Zephyrian Empire offered to place their remaining fleets under human command if it would help save their civilization. Jake Morrison was promoted to Admiral and given authority over all Federation forces in the Outer Rim territories. This was unprecedented because humans had never been trusted with major military commands, but the situation was desperate enough that old prejudices had to be abandoned. Jake accepted the responsibility, but he insisted on using human crews and officers wherever possible because they were the only ones who could think unpredictably enough to surprise the devourers. Lisa Carter made another crucial discovery while studying the quantum mechanics of human consciousness. She found that humans could actually strengthen their natural abilities through concentration and practice. Meditation and mental exercises could increase the intensity of their cognitive static, making them even more disruptive to devourer operations. She began developing training programs to help humans maximize their new capabilities. The first major test of human leadership came when a massive devourer fleet approached the industrial world of New Birmingham. The planet was home to 50 million beings from a dozen different species, and the shipyards there were crucial to the Federation's war effort. Traditional military doctrine would have called for a defensive battle using the orbital weapons platforms and the remaining Zephyrian battleships. But Jake Morrison had learned that conventional tactics were useless against an enemy that could predict logical strategies. Instead, he ordered a completely chaotic attack pattern, using small human-crewed ships that would behave as unpredictably as possible. Each ship captain was told to follow their instincts rather than any predetermined battle plan. The Battle of New Birmingham lasted 14 hours and proved that human tactical thinking could succeed where logical military science had failed. The Devourer fleet expected coordinated attacks and defensive formations, but instead faced hundreds of small ships that moved in seemingly random patterns. The creatures could not predict what the humans would do next because the humans themselves did not know until they did it. Commander Sarah Mitchell, flying a converted cargo hauler, managed to ram her ship directly into a Devourer mothership by following what she later described as a gut feeling about when the creature would be solid. Lieutenant Danny Walsh led a squadron of fighters in an attack pattern that violated every rule of space combat, but somehow worked perfectly against enemies that existed in multiple dimensions. When the battle ended, the Devourer fleet had been scattered and forced to retreat for the first time since the war began. The victory cost many human lives, but it proved that the galaxy's weakest species had become its most effective defenders. Word of the human victory spread throughout Federation, space, and gave hope to billions of beings who had thought their civilizations were doomed. But Jake Morrison knew this was only the beginning. The Devourers would learn from their defeat and adapt their tactics just as they had done with every other species. The real test would come when the creatures launched their final assault on the core worlds where the heart of galactic civilization lay. Humanity would have to discover even greater abilities if they were going to save not just themselves, but every intelligent species in the galaxy. The intelligence reports were terrifying in their scope and detail. Admiral Kate Brooks stood in the command center on New Geneva, looking at holographic displays that showed the largest Devourer fleet ever assembled, moving toward the core worlds of the Federation. The creatures had learned from their defeat at New Birmingham, and they were bringing overwhelming force to ensure that humanity could not surprise them again. Kate had been promoted to Fleet Admiral after Jake Morrison was killed, leading a desperate defense of the Rigel colonies. His sacrifice had bought them 3 weeks to prepare for the final battle, but everyone knew it would not be enough time to evacuate the billions of civilians living in the core systems. New Geneva alone was home to 80 million humans, and the capital city housed the Federation government itself. Dr. Lisa Carter had been working without sleep for days to complete her most ambitious project yet. She believed that individual human consciousness could be linked together to create a planetary defense grid that would amplify their natural abilities to disrupt devourer operations. The theory was sound, but it had never been tested on such a massive scale, and Lisa was not sure if human minds could handle the strain of such intense connection. The plan required volunteers from across human space to link their consciousness with the defense grid using quantum transmitters that Lisa and Pete Rodriguez had developed. These transmitters could synchronize human brain waves and create a collective cognitive field that would extend far beyond the planet's atmosphere. If it worked, the entire New Geneva system would become a zone of quantum chaos that the Devourers could not penetrate. But the volunteers would be taking enormous risks because linking their minds to the grid would expose them to psychic feedback that could cause permanent brain damage or death. Lisa needed at least 10,000 people to create a field strong enough to affect the approaching Devourer fleet, but she was asking ordinary civilians to risk everything for a plan that might not even work. The response from across human space exceeded everyone's expectations. Teachers like Ben Clark, who had never been in a battle, volunteered to link their minds to the defense grid. Mechanics like Maria Santos, who fixed shuttle engines in the orbital shipyards, offered to sacrifice their lives for the chance to save their world. Farmers like Joe Harper, who grew food in the agricultural domes, said they would rather die fighting than live as slaves to creatures that consumed entire civilizations. Within 48 hours, over 50,000 humans had volunteered to join the consciousness grid. They came from every walk of life and every human colony in Federation space. Some were soldiers and pilots who understood the risks of war, but most were ordinary people who had never fired a weapon or commanded a starship. What they all shared was the stubborn human refusal to surrender, even when facing impossible odds. The Devourer fleet arrived at the edge of the New Geneva system exactly when the Federation's best strategic computers had predicted. There were over 3,000 creature ships ranging from small scouts to massive motherships that were larger than entire cities. The fleet moved in perfect formation because the Devourers had evolved beyond individual thinking into a collective consciousness that could coordinate millions of creatures simultaneously. Admiral Brooks ordered all available Federation ships to take defensive positions around New Geneva, but she knew they would be destroyed within hours once the battle began. The Zephyrian cruisers and Nexari battleships were powerful, but they had proven useless against an enemy that could predict their every move. The real defense would have to come from the human consciousness grid that Lisa had spent weeks preparing. The quantum transmitters were activated when the Devourer fleet reached the outer planets of the system. Across New Geneva and throughout human space, 50,000 volunteers closed their eyes and opened their minds to the collective network that Lisa had created. The effect was immediate and overwhelming as human consciousness began linking together in ways that had never been attempted before. Ben Clark felt his mind expanding beyond his individual thoughts as he connected with farmers and factory workers and starship crews across the galaxy. Maria Santos experienced the memories and emotions of thousands of other humans as their consciousness flowed together like streams joining a mighty river. Joe Harper discovered that his simple thoughts about growing crops were part of a vast human dream of life and growth that stretched across space and time. The Devourers began their attack expecting to face the same logical defensive strategies they had encountered and defeated throughout the galaxy. But instead of organized resistance, they met something they could not understand or predict. The space around New Geneva had become filled with chaotic human thoughts and emotions that interfered with their ability to maintain quantum coherence. The creature ships that tried to phase through the planet's defensive satellites found themselves trapped in normal space where human weapons could actually hurt them. The motherships that attempted to drain energy from the orbital cities discovered that human consciousness was actively fighting back against their feeding processes. For the first time since the war began, the Devourers found themselves facing an enemy they could not simply overpower or outsmart. But the battle was far from one-sided and the cost was enormous. The psychic feedback from maintaining the consciousness grid was killing human volunteers by the hundreds. Ben Clark collapsed at his transmitter station as his mind burned out from the strain of channeling so much collective thought. Maria Santos died with a smile on her face as she felt the combined will of humanity flowing through her consciousness. Joe Harper's last thought was about the seeds he had planted that spring and how they would grow into food for the survivors. Admiral Brooks watched the tactical displays as both sides took terrible losses in a battle unlike anything in galactic history. Human ships were being destroyed, but they were taking Devourer vessels with them in ways that should have been impossible. The consciousness grid was weakening as more volunteers died, but it was still strong enough to keep the creatures from overwhelming the planet's defenses. The turning point came when Lisa Carter made the ultimate sacrifice. She realized that the grid needed a central focus to coordinate the collective consciousness, and she volunteered to become that focus even, though it would certainly kill her. Lisa connected her mind directly to the quantum transmitters and felt the thoughts and dreams of 50,000 humans flowing through her consciousness like a river of fire. With Lisa as the central coordinator, the human consciousness grid became a weapon of incredible power. The chaotic thoughts and emotions of an entire species reached out across space and touched the collective mind of the Devourer fleet. For creatures that existed as pure logic and hunger, the contact with human consciousness was like touching molten chaos, and they recoiled in pain and confusion. The Devourer fleet began to retreat, but they had been permanently changed by their contact with human consciousness. The creatures that had consumed 1,000 civilizations found themselves infected with human emotions and unpredictability. They could no longer think with perfect logic or coordinate their actions with absolute precision because humanity had introduced chaos into their ordered existence. The silence after the battle was more profound than any sound Admiral Kate Brooks had ever heard. The Devourer fleet had retreated into the dark space between galaxies, but they had not been destroyed. Instead, something far more significant had happened during the final moments of the consciousness grid's operation. The creatures that had existed as pure hunger and logic for millions of years now carried fragments of human consciousness within their collective mind. Dr. Lisa Carter had died in the process of coordinating the grid, but her sacrifice had achieved something that no weapon or military strategy could have accomplished. When 50,000 human minds had touched the Devourer collective consciousness, they had infected it with the chaotic, unpredictable nature of human thought. The creatures could no longer function as perfect predators because they now experienced doubt and confusion and even primitive emotions. Pete Rodriguez had survived the battle, but he was forever changed by his connection to the consciousness grid. He could still sense the quantum fields that the Devourers used to travel between dimensions, and he realized that those fields now carried traces of human thought patterns. The creatures had become trapped between their original nature and the humanity that now existed within their minds. They could not return to their pure state of logical hunger, but they also could not fully embrace the chaos of human consciousness. The solution that emerged was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Instead of trying to destroy the Devourers, the surviving humans chose to contain them using the same consciousness techniques that had won the battle. Human volunteers would maintain a permanent psychic barrier that prevented the creatures from fully existing in normal space while also preventing them from escaping to consume other galaxies. Jake Morrison had been presumed dead after his ship was destroyed at Rigel, but he had actually been transported into the dimension where the Devourers existed between attacks. He spent 3 months in that strange space learning to communicate with creatures that were struggling to understand the human thoughts now part of their collective mind. When he finally returned to normal space, Jake brought with him knowledge that would reshape galactic civilization. The Devourers were not evil in any way that humans could understand. They were ancient beings that had evolved in the dark space, between galaxies where there was no life except what they could consume from younger civilizations. They had never experienced concepts like growth or creation or cooperation because their entire existence had been focused on survival through consumption. The human consciousness that now infected their minds was teaching them that there were other ways to exist. Admiral Brooks established the Human Vanguard as a new military organization dedicated to protecting the galaxy from threats that conventional forces could not handle. Unlike traditional military units, the Vanguard was based on the consciousness-linking techniques that had defeated the Devourers. Human volunteers would train to expand their natural abilities and work together as collective minds when facing enemies that existed beyond normal space and time. The other species of the galaxy were humbled by humanity's sacrifice and victory. The Zephyrian Empire that had once looked down on humans as weak and short-lived now sought human teachers to help them understand the quantum nature of consciousness. The Nexari Collective abandoned their pure logic programming and began incorporating human emotional algorithms into their AI systems. Even the ancient Vorthon Republic admitted that their millions of years of experience had not prepared them for threats that could only be defeated by embracing chaos and unpredictability. Commander Alex Stone, who had survived the original Kythera encounter, became the director of a new research institute dedicated to studying the relationship between consciousness and reality. His work built on Lisa Carter's discoveries and led to breakthroughs in understanding how thought and emotion could affect the fundamental forces of the universe. Humans were not just resistant to certain types of attacks, but were actually capable of reshaping reality through the power of their chaotic minds. The Federation was restructured with humans taking leadership roles in areas that required creative thinking and adaptation to unknown threats. This was a complete reversal of the previous system, where humans had been considered too unreliable for important responsibilities. Now their unpredictability was recognized as the galaxy's most valuable strategic asset against enemies that could predict and counter logical responses. Sam Parker, who had distinguished herself during the evacuation campaigns, was promoted to admiral and given command of the new Rapid Response Fleet. This force consisted entirely of human-crewed ships that could be deployed quickly to handle situations where conventional military thinking would be ineffective. The fleet's success rate was remarkable because they approached every problem with the assumption that standard solutions would not work. The most significant change was in humanity's understanding of their own nature. For centuries, they had accepted other species' judgment that they were weak and inferior, but the war with the Devourers had revealed that their supposed weaknesses were actually evolutionary advantages. Human emotions that other species saw as primitive were actually sophisticated tools for processing information and making decisions in chaotic situations. Pete Rodriguez continued his work developing technology that could interface with human consciousness and amplify their natural abilities. His quantum resonance engines allowed human ships to phase partially out of normal space, just like the Devourers had done. His consciousness amplifiers let small groups of humans create localized reality distortions that could protect entire planets from dimensional threats. The galaxy began to rebuild, but it was fundamentally different from what had existed before. Every species had learned that pure logic and advanced technology were not enough to guarantee survival against threats that operated beyond conventional understanding. The old certainties about superior and inferior races had been shattered by the revelation that consciousness itself was a form of power that could reshape reality. Ben Clark's children grew up in a world where being human meant being a guardian of all intelligent life. Maria Santos's nephew became an engineer who learned to build machines that responded to thought and emotion rather than just logical programming. Joe Harper's farm was transformed into a research facility where scientists studied how human consciousness could influence the growth and development of living things. The Devourers remained contained in their dimensional prison, but they were no longer the same creatures that had consumed 1,000 civilizations. The human consciousness within their collective mind continued to change them, and some Federation scientists believed that eventually they might become allies rather than enemies. The possibility that humanity's greatest victory might ultimately be achieved through compassion rather than conflict was perhaps the most remarkable transformation of all. Admiral Brooks often stood on the observation deck of New Geneva Station, looking out at the stars and thinking about how much had changed. Humanity had been weak until the universe gave them a reason to discover their true strength. That strength had not come from better weapons or superior technology, but from embracing the chaotic, unpredictable nature of human consciousness and using it to protect all life in the galaxy. The species that had once been dismissed as inferior had become the guardians of existence itself.